if you could think about how, or help me think about how some kinds of skeptical problems can be put in both forms, and sometimes the very same philosopher will use them in different ways for different purposes. So think of Hume and the way he presents the problem about the uniformity of nature in the first enquiry, where it's a skeptical doubt followed by a skeptical solution to the doubt, versus how he presents in the treatise, which is a problem of how is it possible to think of necessity in nature at all. So it seems more of he doesn't use the language of skepticism at all in the treatise to describe causation. It's just a question of how do we find, he uses the word once in his discussion of causation actually, but it's just a question of how is it possible to think of necessities in nature. So it seems much more of the latter form. And Hume seems to move between the two forms with great ease and fluidity sometimes. So in when he's thinking about our experience of the external world, he starts out by saying, how is it possible for us to even to think of continuing objects as coherently existing things at all? So he's asking the second question, and then he turns into it, well, now that we know that we can think of them in this way, why, now it's a question of doubting their existence because I can have a duplicate of it when I press my eye, and so on. He moves from the latter form of skepticism to the former form, and you were kind of suggesting that it tended to go the other way, I think, in the way you were presenting the story. McDowell, but I was wondering whether you were wanting to say that there is a kind of, what is the relation between the two is what I'm asking you. With Hume is an interesting case in that he moves between them so dramatically, most obviously asking a series of skeptical doubts that look kind of like Cartesian in form in the treatise, but ending up with a moment of utter despair, a boggle, as you call it, of the kind that you associated with the second form of skepticism in the conclusion to Book 1 of the treatise, where he's no longer even able to move his limbs because he's lost touch with reality entirely. So just if you could reflect on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, you've asked, I think, quite a few questions. I'll just answer a few. We can maybe take up others later. I better get back to the microphone because I feel my voice going. And you're using something which I'd actually, claim is a member of a verbal triplet, moving between the two forms of skepticism. That can be heard a lot of different ways. Some of the way you're spelling out what it means, I don't think is very apt as a characterization of Hume. Unless I think a way of hearing what that could mean, is very right about Hume. And you're right. So let's just say we can have forms of, let's just put it unbelievably vaguely for a moment, hybridity in philosophers, where both forms somehow seem to be present. I think the thing that would be the best and the fullest case of a philosopher who is, as it were, self-consciously moving from one form to another is a philosopher who could first distinguish the forms. So one could say when they're moving. I think Kant, in the Transcendental Deduction, is addressing what I'm calling the second form of skeptic. The person that makes the very possibility of objective validity or objective purport an illusion. Then, in the Refutation of Idealism, in the second edition, he makes it clear how he thinks this has to do with something he actually doesn't use the word skeptic for properly. He calls problematic idealism, cart. And if you see how his address to the person he calls the skeptic, who has brought the very possibility of reason into question in this more violent way, you'll also see why you cannot set up Descartes' question the way he wants to. So whether you like Kant's story or not, I think those two parts of the critique are aptly describing as someone who's going from raising the first form of question, first form of skeptical question, to the second, and saying how they are related. Now, here's a different kind of case, which is not Hume either, but which is interesting. Philosophers who, in one part of their work, really clearly and rigorously and without much wavering are just concerned with the first form. And then somewhere else, usually written some years later, often focusing on someone else who they're trying to follow, are concerned with the second form. And in many such cases, I think Putnam is a good example of this, I think Cavell is a good example of this, they don't realize that over here, what they're doing over here and what they're doing over there are related. I think McDowell's an interesting example of someone who went from the second sort to the first sort. So I think it's something like criteria to feasibility of knowledge, his early articles about disjunctivism, he's worried about the first form. In Mind and World, worrying about other things, when he started worrying about Sellers and reading Kant in a certain way, he started talking about the second form. In the preface, especially in the passage preface I've quoted, he's gotten clear about how he thinks these two things are related. I think in a way he wasn't when he wrote that book. And so various kinds of words, actually, things just being open are present to us in experience, actually admit of two different understandings, depending upon which, and he's not clear about these at that point. So Hume, I don't think, is that case either. Hume is someone who wants to describe his skepticism as Pyrrhonian. He makes certain noses that connects it with Pyrrhonianism in certain ways, though I think other features of Pyrrhonianism do not apply well to Hume, like, for instance, that it's something you're supposed to live. Secondly, I think the main template he has for it is Cartesian. When he first starts talking about, for instance, the problem of body, it looks like it is. I think this use of the word is clearly tied to what I'm calling the second problem, a fiction. So it's a mere appearance as opposed to reality. Body is a fiction. Various things are fictions. All that is really given are these various, as it were, patches of appearance. But the body itself is something we postulate. He tries, when he talks about causation, in some ways, to force it under that template, especially when it comes of what he calls skepticism about substance. But it very quickly, and this is what Kant sees, starts to take on a different form, where it starts to be unclear how it is that we could have experience at all. When Kant says Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers, I take it he means not that Hume fully understood his skeptical problem and Kant just wants to repeat it. But Kant is thinking, if we think through this problem about causation strictly, and then we see that you can raise it with respect to all 12 categories, then the lights go out, and what we have is less than a dream, much less than Hume thought we could have. In Hume's account of what is merely given before we, as it were, reach to the fictions. So Hume is someone who I think you do see these various, as it were, ways of talking that fit the different forms of skepticism. But I don't think he's clearly got in view what the shape of his problem is. That's an area, certainly I think Kant's view of Hume, I would argue. So I think you're absolutely right. That if we look at this formulation, we look at this formulation, it seems to move around. But I wouldn't say that Hume is, the way they're related is as they were in my first two cases, or that he himself takes himself to be going from the one to the other. I don't see much evidence of that. But we could get into discussion. And I'm not so much staked in which is the right thing to say about Hume as in drawing these distinctions. Another interesting case, which is more complicated, which is, kind of going from something like the Hume view to the McDowell view, would be Kripke. I think when Kripke first wrote his article about meaning skepticism, trying to see what Wittgenstein did, he tended to write sentences like this: there's no way to tell whether somebody's adding or quadding. We might say, the best case for Michael Forster adding is indistinguishable from Michael Forster quadding. These two things are indistinguishable based on what's actually given, his performances. But then he'd often, by apposition, have a comma and say, there is no fact to the matter about what one means. By the time Kripke writes the preface to his book, and he's expanded the article of the whole book, and he's added footnotes. It's a little bit like McDowell's preface. Then he says, I want to distinguish with an epistemological way of putting the question. And Wittgenstein's a real problem. And he says, the epistemological way of putting the question is a ladder we must climb up and throw away. And if we really understand our problem, this has to do with my last feature on my list of features of the second form. Then we see the problem is so severe we cannot even pose it. We start by saying, we cannot tell whether he's adding or quadding. And then we say there's no fact to the matter about whether he means this or that. But then we realize those words we just uttered, there's no fact to the matter about whether he means this. There's no fact to the matter about what those words mean. This is what Kripke means when he says the very idea of meaning goes up in smoke. That problem has now acquired a different form. So you can also have philosophers who are understanding one of your verbal triplets in one way and then moving to another. I don't see Hume ever clearly making that move that Kripke made. Though I think Kripke first was much like Hume. But then he writes this preface saying how he thinks he's misunderstood. He doesn't rewrite the whole book, though, being Kripke. He writes, people record it, it gets typed up, and then he adds stuff to it. But so there's much to talk about there.
I think in the case of Hume, he got himself into the second form and the absolute loss of everything and then recast a lot of it in the first form where it's more tractable.
I think he sorts, the other thing glimmers, but he doesn't want it to be that untractable. But I think what Kant thinks is what's really deep about Hume is the posing of the question in the second form.
So I think that the distinction is really interesting. I disagree with so much of it. Well, yeah, I disagree with so much of it, and I almost don't know where to start. I'm just going to say that about Kripke, what you were just saying in response, I really do disagree with the reading that you just gave, and that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow.
I was just quoting Kripke, actually.
But,
I mean, the phrase, we must kick away the epistemology, that's important.
When I look at these, you've basically given us here 10 skeptical problems. And or not necessarily skeptical, but 10 different problems. And you at least suggested, with what you said about the sociological plane, that these 10 problems are all kind of represented in the literature. Because you said this is sociological. By and large, when somebody raises the Cartesian version of the problem, somebody else will raise the Kantian version of the problem. But it seems to me, when I go through these columns, that in each case, only one of the two possible problems seems either convincing to me or kind of firmly represented in the literature. So just focusing on the first point, it seems like in the Cartesian case, yes, I'm really convinced by the philosophy of perception problem, and I'm really convinced by the Cartesian version of the problem of other minds, but when it comes to what you describe as the Cartesian version of the philosophy of language problem, I don't see that as a possible compelling skeptical problem. Conversely, when I look at the first three in the Kantian versions, I'm inclined to think of the first of those as actually a version of what I think is the real problem about meaning and intentionality. The second one, I have a hard time getting my mind around, but the third one seems like the one about language, seems like a genuine problem. So I'm sorry, I realize maybe what I should do now is just focus what I just said.
Did I say something about your second focus? I think there's some misreporting.
Okay. Yeah, all right.
So I can hang on to that.
All right.
I did not say that each of these forms are firmly represented in the literature. I didn't even say for any two forms that they are represented in the literature.
Okay.
What I said, I did make a philosophical point. Wherever one is possible, the other is possible.
Okay.
I also think that the tendency of the literature is for the second form to gradually come along, like the dictionaries of philosophy, which I think they have. And then eventually, for in modern philosophy, over time, they'll wipe out the first. So, as a matter of sociology, I think you tend not to get a phase, except a very brief one, where they're both equally firmly represented. I also agree with the following thing about contemporary philosophy of language, that the second form is dominant. No one's interested in the first form. And I agree also about other minds, that unless you realize some of these issues about how machines can think and so forth is related, as I think they are, that the first form is the one that's dominant, and no one's talking about the second form. That's a feature of the literature. And that leads people to say that which form you get is a function of the content. But I think that's giving the sociology of what's firmly entrenched the wrong place. It's giving philosophical fashion the wrong place. But I completely agree with your sociology. But up to this point, I actually do. I have quotations for all of these things in James Conant. Think that those 10 cases, I don't think they're 10 problems, actually. I think there are those two, depending upon how they're related. And I actually don't even think they're two unrelated. It's actually makes a bit more problem here. But these 10, as it were, symptoms of something are all related in literature. But you have to go and see where you find it. If you want, for instance, I won't say anything else. You go on the first form of the philosophy of language question, look at people in literary studies. They are all over the place. So how do we tell which interpretation is correct? And for a very long time, there was a huge issue in the philosophy of law, too. It's only recently, the philosophy of law, and mostly, not yet, the literature departments, that they made the transition to the second form. So there's nothing about it that's unasking. But I completely agree with your sociology of contemporary philosophy of language.
Okay, well, that's really helpful. Then we're not disagreeing anywhere near as much as I worry about the philosophy of language, Cartesian version of the philosophy of language question, which is even, it seems like a completely indefensible form of skepticism, because it just seems, I just can't get my mind around the Cartesian form of the philosophy of language question as a serious question, because it seems crucial to the very idea of meaning, that meaning is something that is known. So it doesn't make sense to say, it doesn't make sense to be skeptical about, have you really got the right meaning? Maybe the sign means this thing other than I think it means, but I could never come to know that. Because that just seems to lead to...
I agree with you that a proper account of meaning will have to reveal it as a power of knowledge. I think that's your honesty. I think a coherent account of perception has to reveal it as a power of knowledge. And one of the things that happens in the Cartesian way of setting up, as Clark's protagonists do, what perception is that perception, in its very nature, qua perception, always falls short, as they put it, of the fact. And then we need something else to add to perception, to turn it into knowledge, which actually deprives us of the very idea that perception per se is a power of knowledge. So the point you're making about meaning, I think, and a proper clarification of that notion, and unfolding what happens in the skeptical class is right, but I don't see it as peculiar to skepticism about meaning that some point of this form needs to come up at some point in the life. Now, that it seems that one could just talk about perception while understanding something that as such, of course, falls short of knowledge. And that's a fine thing to do in contemporary epistemological fashion, but not in some quarters, but only some quarters about strikes me as, again, a feature of how particular literatures and philosophy are out of communication with each other. That's something deep about the nature of the problems.
There.
So I have a question about something you didn't say. Sorry. But I mean it's on the paper, so it's on the. So I think I find the distinction between the two forms of skepticism, and to describe this as forms of skepticism very helpful and revealing. But I have a trouble to see the applicability of that distinction with respect to the philosophy of art. I find, the way in which you describe it is, so the first way is, so it's described as, so I have this table here, and the same table is in the museum, and how can I ever know which one is a work of art? So that as the Cartesian voice of framing the question, and then the Kantian skepticism, you describe it as how is it ever possible that this chunk of material or stuff is can so much as appear to be a work of art. But I think that this, why I find it hard to apply that distinction, is that the first worry somehow already presupposes that the table at least appears to me to be as a work of art, and I think it even doesn't appear to me as a work of art. The first immediately seems to be the second one. I find it hard to formulate already the first one with respect to art, whereas I understand, how does something, my perception be true, but I have an understanding of what a perception is, but in philosophy of art, it seems to be that there's even no appearance of a work of art. It seems just to be completely out of, So, is that distinction applicable, or is that not only?
Well, we're much more in agreement than you think, or you might think from what I said there. One reason I have those 5 forms there is because, given time, I'm also interested in how they're related to each other. And I actually think, this is one of the reasons I think aesthetics is interesting, is that, as it were, the transition for reasons I don't completely understand, the history of philosophy actually happens first in the areas of aesthetics, and most radically and most irreversibly. So I think this is connected, actually, in a way, to Hegel's thought about how, art captures its form of life, and how philosophy reflects in art and what it sees in doing that. So I actually think even more so, and I think this is true as we go through these 4 cases. So I think that Hannah's right about the 3rd case. It's being harder once one's become interested in the 2nd form to be interested in the 1st form. And I think this is even more true of the 5th case. Hannah could make her point more strongly. In a sense, you're making the variant of Hannah's case more strongly with respect to the 5th form. That's a further progression. I'm interested in how they stand to each other. Or to put it differently, both Kant and Kripke in different ways want to say about the perception case and the language case, there is nothing which is living it. Isn't anything which is even clearly expressing the doubt. Where there is a different kind of possibility of the illusion that we could live aesthetic skepticism. It becomes a certain kind of reality in what people call art. And once that happens, the first way of hearing it is hard. But nevertheless, so I do think any real clarity about art, this is even more true, I think it's a more radical point of the thing that Hannah and I was just talking about, requires that one see that one can't really draw a kind of distinction that certain analytic philosophers want to draw between, shall we call it, meta-aesthetics and normative aesthetics, where first we just have some things that are classified as art. And then we want to know whether they're valuable in the way that works of art. Is it a good one or not? That, if you will, the concept of art is itself an honorific. And we can talk about which ones are more or less great, but only if we already see them as works of art. I actually agree with that point. I think it would be relevant to the treatment of the problem. But, as I was saying to Hannah, as a matter of sociological fact, if you want to see certain analytic philosophers who I think are unbelievably unclear about the points you're trying to make here, you can find Arthur Danto initially motivating aesthetic, issues of aesthetic problems in an incredibly Cartesian way by saying, here are these 2 things. They are completely, we have an indistinguishability problem. As they are given, it's the same object. Now we need something further to confer on the Brillo box out of the museum that makes the Brillo box in the museum a work of art. What must we add so that that happens? And in fact, as soon as you pose the question like that, you've almost begged yourself to answer it in something like the form of what gets called the institutional theory of art. That, as a going theory, presupposes, I think, that form of question to get that form of answer. I agree. It's not a good way of thinking about things. But as a matter of sociology, I do think both those forms are out there. Sorry. Apologize for my tradition.
Thank you very much. So I have a question regarding the form-matter distinction. So you want to say that these 5 examples express the matter of skepticism, and that it's in virtue of their form that we see their unity. Is that?
I want to say, notice what's going on here. That's a way you might want to express it. And then that raises the question of what is form and matter in here and how are they related?
Right.
So one thing you might think is the form is completely independent of the matter, and the matter is completely independent of the form.
Okay.
That was the question I was neutral on.
Right, right.
I actually want to reject that way of thinking about it, and we could talk about that.
Okay.
But I did not mean to be describing, so I committed myself to that way of thinking about it.
So I have maybe a slightly different question. So it occurred to me that these 5 examples, they're sort of articulated from a theoretical point of view. Even the 4th and 5th examples, even though they concern action theory and theory of art, it's still, the salient question is sort of, how can we know things?
Do you mean the 4th and 5th examples of the first form?
Well, with both.
No, the second question I don't think is focused on the question of what we can know in the first instance.
The problem of whether my, or you mean, oh no, sorry. The forms differ in virtue of whether we're asking about knowledge or cognition, or the conditions of possibility for knowledge or cognition. I want to say there seems to be the theoretical standpoint is what's common between them, and what's common between all of the 5 examples that you've listed here.
That distinction between conditions, knowledge, and condition, I tried to explode by saying I thought it was totally unhelpful way of distinguishing the 2 cases. As far as I can tell, your summary of what I said depends upon that being a clear way of distinguishing the 2 cases.
Maybe the most direct way I can get to my question is simply, does anything change, or is there any relevance in thinking of examples that would be from the practical point of view. So where the question wouldn't be about knowledge, say, but motivation. Skeptical problems that could concern how we're motivated rather than how we could know things. I guess that's what I was...
I do think the following. There are important differences between factual and theoretical reasoning. And a proper account of those differences would involve a difference in the form of such reasoning, the form of such judgment. But if you, as it were, parse skeptical problems the way the people who are posing them in my typology do, those differences in form won't come into difference. And then what you should be struck by is just like you can have a question about, I tried to do the parables. Just like you could have a question about, well, yes, I understand what somebody's thinking, but how do I know they're really thinking that? I can see them make a certain kind of motion, but I can wonder whether they really are raising their hand to ask a question or doing something else. And conversely, in the Kantian case, I can start to wind up with a conception of perception, which it becomes completely unclear, having parsed what is given and what is meant from each other in such a way. How every element of an order of sensory manifold or an order of science could be anything but dead. And then you get the same thing in what is called philosophy of action. A going question in philosophy of action today, misunderstanding the spirit in which Wittgenstein asked us this question, was when we subtract from my hand going up, when we subtract from my raising my hand going up, what's left? So the idea is we parse it, just as we did in the second form of theoretical case, as some bodily movement plus some differentiation, which is introduced through, as it were, the adding of the intention. And that analysis of what action is, I do think yields a completely parallel form of skeptical problem to the one we get in theoretical class. Not because the two cases are not really properly understood of the same form, but whatever their differences in form may be, are not going to come out to view when the question is posed in that form.
Last question, sorry, I have to cut off two people, but we are otherwise running out of time. Mike. Actually, three people are on the list, but only in order to have this apology.
Thanks very much, Jim. I think that was a wonderful talk. I particularly find this distinction between the two types of skeptical questions that are being asked over these different domains quite illuminating, and especially for the philosophy of the last 50 years or whatever period you're interested in. My questions is really whether this is unhelpful as a taxonomy, not whether the confusions occur that you say occur. I buy all of this. My question is whether this is, in the end, better seen as a sort of special case of a broader state of affairs. It struck me when you took the Bertrand Russell quote, but I actually don't know which skeptical problem he's talking about there, because in problems of philosophy, this could have been taken from two different contexts. It could have been taken from the external world, skeptical problem, or it could have been taken from sort of the confrontation of the manifest image with the scientific image regarding the solidity of things like tables and chairs. That problem. So both are talked about in that book. So it's not. You don't need to worry about whether that's indeterminate or not. That's not really the key issue. But there is actually a third form of skepticism right there, right? I mean, a kind of scientific skepticism about the deliverances of everyday belief. And one can multiply that further. I mean, for example, to take two forms that were strongly represented and contrasted in antiquity, you have a kind of equipolant skepticism in people like Feyerabend. Right? Whatever the view is you're holding in science or whatever, there's always a competing, perhaps incommensurable view that you cannot really adjudicate between in any obvious way, which poses the problem of adjudication between the two alternatives. Or you have paradox skepticism, as you might call it. In the ancient world, this was Parmenides' thing, and Zeno, and then Socrates in a moral form, the academic skeptics. And that has more to do with finding self-contradictions in concepts or in positions. And you could say, well, you know, quite a lot of what's done these days is a bit like that. I mean, look at Graham Priest talking about the liar paradox. Look at deconstruction or whatnot. I mean, there are many things that you might call skepticism, even in the last 50 years, beyond the two that you distinguish. And of course, every time you get two forms, the possibility arises of the kind of miscommunication that you're rightly, I think, focusing on, where people are really talking past each other, using the same formulas, but meaning different kind of skeptical worries.
Well, I agree with sort of, I think, the thrust of your question, while actually would want to quibble over a lot of the detail. So, I mean, the thrust of the question is, are these two forms that I've distinguished here exhaustive? Definitely not. Don't think they are. We could start talking about what would be other genuine differences in form. And I think one is certainly right. A skepticism that motivates itself with equipollence and then, you know, aims at a certain kind of suspension, that is, doubt itself would be viewed as a form of dogmatism within that skepticism, is going to issue in something that has a very different form than the Thomson-Clark first form. So I completely agree with that. If someone is really sticking, you know, to the method of equipollence as practiced in ancient philosophy. So the distinction you draw in your book on Hegel and skepticism, which I like very much, between ancient skepticism and modern skepticism there, would be between a form of skepticism which is neither of my forms and the thing I was calling my first form. And I would completely agree, that's a distinction which I would want to motivate at the level of form. And I could actually go through my 9 features, which I have pairs on this list, and we could talk about what the 9 features are for that form, in which the second one will not be doubt, and it will not be what I call boggle, as in my second form, but it would be equipollence. And all the other forms will differ all the way down. And the 9th one, importantly, the 9th feature in my first form is something that one can think but one cannot live. In my second case, the 9th feature is something one cannot even think. In your, as it were, prior form, it's importantly something one can both think and live. So all of these features are going to interrelate with each other. That's why you can't put it as some words. You have to see all of the features interrelate to change the form. So I definitely agree there's more than 2 forms. On the other hand, most of the things you mentioned struck me as too vaguely extended to place them somewhere. So I think you could have an issue about the manifest in the scientific image that had my first form, where you think, well, this thing sure seems to be true, and then there's this other one, the scientific image, that describes the world in a really different way. And now we want to know which of these is true. We know what they each say the world is, and now we have a choice which we have to choose about which one we endorse, which is really true, we could say, blah, blah. That is still going to be a version of my first form. It's going to differ in some of the detail, but it wouldn't, you know, it's not about houses, and they're not being tables and chairs because of something about sense data, but because something about science, but it still belong to my first form. Whereas, when you get to the point where Paul Churchland does, where he thinks, all of these things are actually something that cannot be translated into a power picture of the world. You know, they are actually empty. When we talk about tables and chairs, we need to eliminate these notions, not because they're false, because strictly thought through, we realize, you know, they don't have content in the way we think. Then that's a picture of what is illusory about, you know, about the manifest image, which touches its very purport, not just its truth. And that's starting to turn to an issue, you know, which one gets out of certain students of Sellers, and, you know, limitivists and people like that. I think Quine's work forces a move in this direction, which then would belong to my second form of skepticism about the relationship between the manifest and scientific image. So you can't extend a difference in form through a content, like it's about the scientific image. But I agree, you could get, you know, one or the other there. And so forth. I think there are skeptical paradoxes that go with each form. I mean, we could talk about a Cartesian kind. So being focused on a paradox is, for me, not going to isolate the form. But there are differences in forms of paradox which would be tied to the form for me. So I agree with the general thrust of your question, but then a lot of your examples I would still want to, as it were, say, are at the level of the verbal triplets then, which we could distribute over all 3. We'd have to characterize them further before we'd actually place them in one of the columns.
I mean, I guess I worry a bit that you're doing there what you're saying you don't want these people to do, namely that conflating different skeptical questions. I mean, if the first of your two types is a problem about how can we know, then that's not what I was getting at with the science versus...
Okay, then it will belong, then I'll agree with you. But then we need to add that further detail.
Yeah,
I agree.
And of course they can all, one of the things that happens, the more complicated this gets, the more complicated interactions and hybrid forms you can have. For example, just to take the distinction between equipollence and paradox skepticism, it can very well be that paradox skepticism gets, as it were, absorbed into a form of equipollence skepticism, providing the resources for one side of the argument that you then counterbalance with another argument. And these kinds of interactions can, of course, take place on virtually all of these fronts.
But now I think you're raising a slightly different question than any I meant to be addressing, which I am incredibly interested in, which is something like the question which I did pose at a certain point at the end of my talk, which is, and I said, one thing I like about McDowell is a few people I know actually asked this question, whatever you think of his answer, which is, how are these forms of skepticism related? And McDowell thinks they're not just independent of each other. He thinks, in fact, using your language about what you were calling the first and second type, the first type gets absorbed into the second type. So a view you could have, which I didn't mean to be endorsing, but I also left it open, was that these different things are just independent of each other. So they can't be in any way absorbed into each other. And I also think that's wrong. But I do think that absorption involves transformation of form. So one of the things that will happen, is if we get absorbed into something that has the form of a Pyrrhonian skepticism. I don't think Pyrrhonian skepticism is dead just because it came first, by any means. It's something I like about your book, actually. Then the form of paradox itself will come into view in a different way. So I'm actually, I think, more in sympathy with what some of you are saying. But I agree that the talk left that question open.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question about the relation.
So